Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Dr. Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, people. Wagwan Panwatagwan, and welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we explore the ideas, the histories, and innovations shaping the Caribbean and its global diaspora. Today's episode takes us into the world of food, but not the way we often think about it. When Caribbean food enters global conversations, it's usually through recipes, restaurants, or even tourism. A lot of the time, these powerful cultural expressions, they're important to who we are, but they only represent part of the story. Behind every dish, there are deeper questions about agriculture, trade, labor, sustainability, and the economic futures of Caribbean societies. Continuing our theme for this month on Caribbean futures, highlighting especially for Caribbean American Heritage Month, we're exploring the idea of moving Caribbean food from recipes to systems. What would it mean to transform our rich culinary traditions into scalable food products and industries? Ones that support food security, create jobs, and build lasting economic infrastructure for the region. This conversation invites us to think beyond what tastes good and toward what sustains us economically, culturally, and collectively as a region and as a diaspora. Before we jump into today's conversation, I'm really grateful to have Taymer Mason here joining us on the show. Taymer is a food scientist and Caribbean product developer with over 20 years of experience across multiple sectors. Taymer, I'll turn to you and ask you to tell a little bit more about yourself to our listeners, where in the region you call home, and what inspired your interest in food sustainability, product concepts, and cultural storytelling.
Thank you for having me. And I want to say hello to all of your readers. My name is Taymer Mason, and I'm from the beautiful island of Barbados, and I call Barbados home. I'm only 1 month in. I've just moved back to Barbados after 20 years of living in Europe and some of the wider Caribbean, and I'm really excited to be on your show. So, how did I get into food? I got into food in a very unorthodox way. A lot of Caribbean households, the daughter is supposed to know how to cook at a very early age. I was not one of them. I was into my books. I was reading Sweet Valley High, different things, and I just never had an interest in cooking until one day, one of my aunts came back from America, and she saw that I had no interest in cooking, and she chastised me, and it wasn't a compliment. And I said, you know what? This summer, I'm going to learn to cook. And that one summer I set out, I was about 14 years old, and I set out to learn everything I wanted to learn about food. And I started to fall into a world of what can we use? What else can we use? Why are we making the same dishes every Sunday? Why can't we do this instead? And I started to question my parents, and they were like, this is tradition. And that's how I entered food. After I did my undergrad in microbiology, I did an internship at a food factory here in Barbados. And I think the rest was history. From the time they met me, they told me, you know what, you can stay. You can stay after graduation and you can have a full-time job here. And I started to develop products. I started to take ownership of a lot of the projects that they had there at the business. And that's how I really got into food. And I never left. I've worked in all aspects of food. I've worked in HACCP. I've worked in food safety. I've worked in as an executive chef at a hotel. I have also worked in health and safety and product development. So I've worked in all aspects of food. In terms of sustainability and falling in love with that, in 2010, after moving to the island of St. Martin, or 2008, I couldn't find a job. And it was very difficult for me because I've just left school. I just left university and I left that job that I was in and I couldn't find anything. And I've turned to food again and I started to document a lot of the recipes that I grew up eating in Barbados because I was homesick. And I got a book deal very quickly after. And at that time I was vegan and vegan wasn't popular back then in 2008. And I got this book deal and I started to go deeper into food sustainability. In 2019, I returned to Barbados for a sabbatical. And I started to look at cassava deeply. I started to look at everything that we had around us. We were making a lot of food products like cassava flour, breadfruit flour, and different things, but a lot of people didn't know how to use it. And I started experimented making crackers, and I started making a lot of plant-based products. And I had a friend, she had a gluten intolerance, and she said to me, I love your plant-based meat made out of gluten, but I can't eat it anymore. It's making me ill. And I said, well, what can I do? She said, you're a food scientist. You'll figure it out. And I turned to cassava and pigeon peas. And that's how we created our first meat analog using those two concepts, cassava for the structure and the pigeon pea for the protein and the fiber. And that's how I got into it.
Thank you for sharing. I think, what you're talking about sort of undergirds my initial question, I think, for this podcast. Because, as I mentioned in the intro, we talk about food and it's often about recipes, or as you said, which day we yam stew peas and which day is fried chicken day
Mhm.
and what have you. But there are larger problems, I think, especially when it comes to our food. And I really think one thing that undergirds that is the economies in the Caribbean, right? As you were sort of also alluding to, what to
Mhm.
do with the cassava flour, et cetera. Especially from my perspective, Caribbean economies are heavily reliant on tourism, which means, they're obviously vulnerable to external shocks, whether that's natural disasters, economic downturns, etc. But that often also means that because of our reliance on tourism, there is sort of a prioritization on consumption over production, right? Meaning
Oh,
that
yes.
wealth doesn't always, sit and circulate in the ways that are important for us locally, as opposed to, building long-term infrastructure. And so I sort of just wanted to turn to you in your expertise as a food scientist and maybe give you an opportunity to share how you think, there are major issues or gaps within the Caribbean's various economies, and how, things like foreign investment, dependency on tourism and all these other things also shape the problems that we're going to be talking about going forward in the episode.
Well, post-emancipation, we turned to sugar, especially in Barbados. We turned to sugar, and that was our moneymaker. And then tourism kind of took over time. A lot of the issues are that a lot of the islands have a high import bill, a really, really high import bill. And when people go to the islands, they see all this food, these mangoes, and all the breadfruit, and they're wondering how can the island have such a high import bill? A lot of our food systems have been shaped externally by North America and Europe. So a lot of the things that we eat are not always from the region. So that's why we have a high import bill. And a lot of things we import are things like rice, flour, pastas, and, and things that we're not really making in the region right now. And I'll talk about how we can make them in the region. But let me go on to talk about the restaurant culture. Restaurant culture is growing in the Caribbean, and that gives tourists experience. But the thing is, if we could create product out of these same recipes, we can create economy, we can create more jobs and everything else. But we haven't done that successfully yet. There are few companies in the Caribbean that have done it successfully, that started in the 70s, that have kind of worked out all their kinks over the last couple of decades. But we need to do more now because the gate is closing, and we went through those shocks, especially 7 years ago, and we need to kind of respond to it now. And it's not only growing more crops, but it's how to convert these crops into products that people like and that the younger generation would like and everything else. And we need to start making them quickly. We don't have a lot of food scientists in the region. A lot of them tend to they tend to graduate and leave and go and work in Europe or the US. So we don't have a lot of them in the region. And when we do have them, they tend to work for a company for most of their career because it's stable. So the innovation sometimes happens from people who are not food scientists. Some of them cannot take it to the level that a food scientist can, and there's sometimes no framework for them to get the support. And let's talk about systems. We talk about having food in the Caribbean and reducing the export bill. But if we don't have the systems in place for the food to turn into a viable product, then we are just going to have different people working in silos, making amazing product, but it's not growing, it's not going anywhere. So let's look at how the systems work. Do you have any questions before I jump into that?
No, we can talk about the systems. I think another part that I'd love for you to share as well is maybe why you think we've tended to focus more on that like restaurant or,
Yeah.
recipes culture as opposed to those broader systems. But yeah, feel free to share.
Yes. So a lot of us in the Caribbean, we are very proud of our culture, our heritage. And a lot of people think that doing something outside of the culture and heritage is wrong. So a lot of people never feel like they have permission to go against the status quo and to create a product. If I tell the average person in the Caribbean to create a product with breadfruit or do something with breadfruit, the first thing they're going to do is steam it and put some saltfish gravy on it. And we know, and that would taste amazing, our make a breadfruit cuckoo. But if I tell them, take that same breadfruit, mash it into zero flour, add an egg, and then roll it and turn it into breadfruit pappardelle, they're going to tell me that I'm asking for too much. But that's easy. And that's pasta that we are importing, and that's pasta that we can make in the region. You see where I'm going with this? The thing is, we need to give people and the young people permission to think outside the box and to create and look at food in new and exciting ways. So, one of the things I want to jump into here is the systems. The reason why we don't have a lot of food product in the region is because we don't have the system set up yet. First of all, the raw materials sometimes are inconsistent, and a lot of the things that we get in the region are seasonal. And while I respect the seasons of the region, if you're making a product to sell and to scale, you have to have constant demand. Secondly, there's not a lot of cooperation amongst the islands. When we have that cooperation amongst the islands, a lot of things are going to be better because you know what? If Guadeloupe has excess cassava or excess breadfruit, we can get it in Barbados. They can get it in Dominica. We need to share what we have because all islands are different. Some are volcanic and some are limestone and some produce more food than others. And we need to share the food amongst each other. Another thing is money. Money is very important. If there's no loans, if there's no revolving loan, if there are no loans for entrepreneurs that are easy to access, they're not going to be willing to put all of their energy into creating food products. So we need more loans in the region for food entrepreneurs. Another thing is packaging. Packaging has always been an issue in the region, and it's not because we don't know how to package well, it's the availability of packaging. A lot of the packaging imports, they import things that have a good sell through, like those pet bottles that you put the natural juices in. You see a lot of them in all the islands. But when it comes to specialty jars, you'll see one or two jars. So then everybody that is making sauces has to use the same jar. And then when it comes to putting your product against another product in the US or in Europe, you're not going to look the same. You're not going to look as kitted out. So we need to start to look at our packaging a bit and take our packaging seriously. We know that we can make the product. It's easy to make the product, but to get the packaging right and to get the messaging right as well. So those are the things in the system that needs to work. And even from my experience here, I moved back here a month ago and trying to open a business in Barbados and a full business in Barbados and to get duty-free exemption. I don't know where to go. There needs to be spaces on the internet for each entrepreneur or any food entrepreneur or cosmetic entrepreneur to go on to see what's the guide. And I've been documenting mine so that people can follow. So after when I go through the process, I can just plug and play. I can say this is what you have to do. But we have to get those sites up. Like all the systems are scattered. We need to get them in one place. So these are the systems that stop food production. And in terms of scaling, a lot of times when you tell somebody in the region that you want to scale, even me, sometimes I think it's 1,000 bottles. It's not 1,000 bottles because if a large chain asks you for product, they want to put it in all of their stores, in all of their states or provinces. They want to get it everywhere. So are we ready for that? No, we're not ready for that. Can we be ready for that in the future? Of course we can, but we need to work together. Even if it takes one island to do it well, and everybody else can copy or to kind of use that formula as like a benchmark, I think that would be the way to go.
Thank you for sharing that. What you brought in terms of it, even your example about breadfruit and its potential to turn into flour, which could then turn, and make pasta, that got me thinking about your work on legacy food products and the fact that I don't think that term has ever really come to my mind, at least. And I don't know, I'm sure that also applies for a number of our listeners when it comes to our foods, right? We have various terms that we use, whether it's ground provisions and, all of these things. But I would love for you to
Yeah.
share with us what you defined as a legacy food product and, what does it look like in practice for us, especially as a region? Why is it important for especially food, Caribbean food entrepreneurs to think about our products in terms of, you know, things that can last beyond just individual businesses?
Yeah. For me, when I define a legacy product, I will say a legacy product is something that can stand the test of time, is not dependent on the founder. So if the founder goes, however, it can still continue for generations and still have an impact on the pop culture or the heritage of that particular nation. Now let's look at some legacy products worldwide. When we think of Italy, I like to go to Italy a lot. And when I go to Italy, I buy up things like pasta, olive oil, things like pistachio paste, and those are their legacy products. If I go to India, I tend to pick up the spices there and all the vanilla, and I bring those home with me. When it comes to the Caribbean, we do have a lot of legacy products. We have our wet seasonings. We would call it jerk in Jamaica, green seasoning in Barbados, or a piece in Haiti. And I would say the French West Indies, they also have a lot of legacy products like Sochia in Guadeloupe. And we do have them there, and they have stood the test of time. But now we need to like kind of pivot and up the thing and do some more. So those things, I would say that as it relates to legacy products, I like to see legacy products that are ambient, meaning that they're shelf stable, that they're not on cold storage, because it makes it easier for the food business to export. It's cheaper for them and there's no wastage. So in terms of something like we'll jump into ready meals after in another part of this talk, but if you have something like a ready meal, trying to export that to say Europe, it has a long cold chain and then the price is going to go up and then you can't compete with what is on the shelf in Europe. So a lot of these things we have to think about when we're creating legacy products, we need to create things that are more shelf stable. I'm not saying that a cold chain product can't be a legacy product. It can be, but when the systems are in place, we still have issues in the region with systems in terms of maritime. Like right now, if I wanted something from Guadeloupe, I don't even know where to begin. I don't really know how to get it from Barbados. So we have issues in terms of transport, linkages within amongst the islands. So that's why it was called a legacy product. Anything that can stand the test of time, we have them, but we need to develop more if we want to compete with the international market. Now, in terms of wet season, I'll give you a joke. I used to make wet season in Toronto and I would sell it. And there was one time I was selling that along with hot sauce, and people were tasting it on tortilla chips. And one person asked me if they can taste the seasoning. I told them no, it's the seasoned meat. And so I was at this it was a place where they had a lot of buyers, and I'm telling them no, they can't taste this product. They need to buy it and take it home to season meat. And I'm gung ho. And you know what? I eventually opened it and people started to come to my table sampling the green seasoning and they started eating it with chips. Did you know? I kid you not. The sale of my green seasonings that day went up. Nobody wanted to see the hot sauce. And guess what they use the green seasoning for? They use it as a dip to eat with chips.
Mm,
So you see now,
which
you see how
we would
well, never
never think of.
that was like blasphemy in the Caribbean. That's like we would never think of doing it. And even if we tried to do it, somebody would try to stop us. But it goes to show you how our food can be interpreted in different ways in different regions. Because in North America, a lot of people use dry seasonings when they are seasoning their food, and wet seasons are not a part of the food culture, so to speak, there. So again, we have to think about if we are flexible enough to like think out of the box and sell out of the box as well.
That's a great point. I think, you raised several issues, right? Whether that be like government and intergovernmental infrastructure, things
Mhm,
like packaging and stuff, right? Um, Also our own creativity, because again, just because things have been done this way for generations and eons doesn't mean we can't pivot in things. You did raise a point about, shelf life and, sort of stability, even packaged foods.
mhm.
And I'd love for us to sort of dig into that a little bit and maybe have you share, how does developing products that really help address larger regional challenges like food security, import dependence, right? I think when we combine some of those bigger frameworks with things like shelf life, right, it helps us to revamp a little bit. And also, are there models in other parts of the world that we could certainly follow to mirror this? I think, especially when it comes to post hurricanes, especially, right?
Mhm,
Just to take Jamaica specifically, after Hurricane Melissa, was so much, discussion about where was hit was, one of the parishes, my parish is seen as the breadbasket of Jamaica, right? What does that mean for the comeback for farmers? Also, everybody was talking about how market prices are through the roof, right? Naturally,
mhm.
because we've lost so much of our crops. And so I have this understanding that, we obviously as a region prioritize fresh foods, right? Our ability to grow foods. But I think there is a difference between shelf life and stability, right? Being able to access fresh foods. And then, when we pair that with various issues that we face as a region, like food insecurity, like natural disasters.
Good question. That's a loaded question. I have a lot to say here. So, one thing before I jump into that, I have to talk about standardization of recipes. No, sometimes when I develop a recipe, I will go into the kitchen and I will just make it and I will make it with my heart. And I know what I'm doing. I have a skill next to me. I have everything next to me to put it down in my notepad. But it's just that thing that takes over the Caribbean spirit when you're cooking that you are not standardizing. And what happens to a lot of food brands, they don't have that kind of consistency. They don't have it all the time. So it changes. Sometimes you will taste a batch and it doesn't taste right or whatever. And that is because that is in our culture to cook with our heart. It's also in our culture to eat fresh foods. So putting a ready meal out there with a 5 day shelf life, and I'm trying to do that in Barbados. We're going to see, and I'm going to see how that works because in Europe, we don't have a lot of frozen meals in Europe. If you look at all the meals that are out there, they're all chilled and they have a shelf life of 7 days. Sometimes you get a little bit more on that. So how do we get the region to eat like that? And I'm not trying to get the region to eat less fresh, but I'm also thinking widely about the aging population. A lot of the population is aging, and a lot of some people never had children or whatever. What are they going to do? And I remember meeting a lot of elderly people in Europe, and I would see them buying a lot of ready meals, and they will buy it for the whole week because they don't have the energy to stand in that kitchen and cook anymore. How do we convert that into formats and foods and cultural foods now for this segment and also for the hospitals to standardize things that they're not overwhelmed anymore, that we can cook for the diabetics, we can cook for the people that have hypertension. A lot of these issues need to be sorted even before we start to scale. As it relates to shelf life and stability and product development, I go right back to where we were talking about who are the food entrepreneurs? Are they getting the help and the support that they want to from food scientists? Maybe not. Maybe it's somebody that had a passion in food that is out there creating something and they're creating it because of the love of it, but they don't understand shelf life. They don't know even how to do a shelf life test. Some islands don't even have testing labs for food. How do we work that? Like, how do we cooperate? Can Barbados take food from like St. Vincent if they don't have one, or or vice versa? How are we cooperating? And we have to have larger food and conversations. A lot of times we have these climate change, sustainability conversations about food, but we're not really addressing the systems and the cooperation. So I think that's where we need to start right there. In terms of stability, we have a very humid environment in a lot of countries. And when we are creating things, we're not thinking about that. We have to think about things that desiccate. When we think about stability as well, we need to also think about how can it serve a country when we have natural disasters. Everybody in the Caribbean has gone through this. When we have natural disasters, they say to stock up on canned and dry goods. We have a few canneries in the region that are canning the Vienna sausages and everything else. But what are we creating in terms of dry soups? What are we creating in terms of rations that can hold people, things that are lightweight, that people can stock up on, things that are affordable? When we're developing products, we need to think about what if. And a lot of times we develop products because of our ego, because we like something, but we're not thinking about the wider picture. So when we're developing, we really need to think about how can we help the region, because these things are inevitable. The hurricanes are inevitable. Sometimes the gates closing are inevitable. How can we sustain ourselves? And that's one of the major questions that anybody developing food needs to answer by the time they start doing even one product. Even adding one product to your line that can help, it's a win.
Pivoting, I guess not really pivoting, but it's sort of in tandem with that. I'd love to get your take on if there are other, and this could, of course, be outside of the Caribbean, if there are other cultures throughout the world that you've seen have done sort of what you're talking about, right? So finding a particular product that, they've pivoted and turned into a sort of something that's has a larger shelf life, or, you know, that they've taken from their traditional food culture, and have really developed into being a successful product for us to then, sort of use that model, and pivot in our own culture.
I'm thinking, because I know that there's many of them, but the answer to that question is I always say this. I fell in love with fufu a year ago or 2 years ago. And at first I didn't understand it. I had cocoa in Barbados, and we had things that like breadfruit cocoa and those kind of formats, but fufu in a box. It's one of my favorite things ever. And I always say that if I'm hungry, fufu is always in that box. And that's the one, it's a convenience food, but it's made out of the flour of, say, green plantain, or even things like dasheen that we have here. It has to be stabilized with potato starch because it doesn't format well when it doesn't have that starch, and it doesn't form into that starchy ball or anything else. And I think that's one thing that Africa gave to themselves, but no, it's in turn giving to the world that format of a dry carbohydrate, that can be put in a box and can be like brought together very quickly with some water and heat. And I have developed something recently that kind of is not on the same level as fufu. So I looked at moringa. Moringa is growing really wild and rampant in the region. I never grew up saying moringa, but it just appeared, and I'm somewhat. And what I did with that product is that people always look at, taking pods and eating the seeds and using it for medicinal purposes. And I was like, you know what? I like these flowers. These flowers are spicy. The leaves don't taste too bad. So what I did is I took dried moringa and I converted it into a spice that you can sprinkle on food, add to your food to increase its nutritional value. So if you're eating rice, rice has X amount of calories, X amount of protein, but with 1 tablespoon of that moringa seasoning, you're going to increase all of your vitamins and minerals, and it tastes good. And I think that would probably change the way how people see moringa and use it in a fun way. We even put it on loaded fries. Like giving that to somebody thinking that it's Italian season, but it's moringa. I think that's kind of cool.
Definitely, I agree. I do want us to um hold space a little bit for you maybe to talk about possible solutions, right? We've talked about various problems, whether that's, distribution pipelines and regional cooperations and partnerships. But what does it look in your mind, or what would you love to see in terms of how we can move from the sort of model of individual business success stories into, building these actual systems that work across the region and work together?
I think that farmers need to step to the front because I think that they are the backbone to our existence. And I think that we rely on them so much. And we've had issues in the past with where farmers don't feel loved by society. And they're not encouraged to grow. I think the first solution is to get farmers and food producers in a room together, so that we can start to work out what they have and what we can make with it. We have young minds ready to do something in society, and I do think that they need to do some workshops where they can like kind of think about what they can create with these products. So I think that's one of the solutions to make creating food exciting, make it look rewarding. Because if people don't see something is rewarding, they're not going to want to do it. Most young people want to be streamers now, and because it's rewarding, how can we make them want to be full entrepreneurs? We need to start showing them the way out of it and the way to success with it. So also even using a success story to show them you could be like her, you could be like this business. I think that's important. I do think that another solution would be for the governments to make it easier for food entrepreneurs to operate. A lot of them don't, and and it has been that way forever. And it's because a lot of people never really talked about it. And if they make life easier for food entrepreneurs, we'll have more of them. And making life easier for me is to remove the import duties on the packaging and remove the import duties on some of the raw material. I do think that entrepreneurs need to be creating from within the region and within what we have on the region at that point. But we can't say that because we're going to need binders, we're going to need some preservatives sometimes, and we don't always make them. And it encourages even scientists and young people to start being the ones that create those preservatives. Research has always been left behind in the region, and we need to actually create a space for that research so that more people are interested in the industry. As it relates to scaling, I do think that some islands are small and they might not be able to scale. But if one hand don't clap, the other can assist. The solution for that is the islands that can do the heavy lifting and the heavy scaling should be able to scale for the smaller food entrepreneurs when they get to that level. I don't think sometimes, even me, I have a product now. If I want to scale, I don't have anybody to turn to. I might have to go back into Europe to get it scale, and that shouldn't be. There are existing food companies now making drink sauces and what's not, and a lot of them don't like to white label, and it has been culturally like this. They don't want to make for other people. They just want to make their brand, and that's it. Then there's issues with NDAs. We don't have systems in place that are affordable for entrepreneurs to access NDAs. They have to go to a lawyer now and and spend a lot of money, and that's something that a food entrepreneur doesn't have. So a lot of things has will have to change, and those are the solutions to encourage existing food producers to white label so that it makes space for more products. And one of the other solutions for me is if you're complaining as a region and saying, "Oh, we have a high import bill," we need to do an audit. What it is that we are importing that is causing this bill to be so high? If it's rice, some of islands in Barbados for sure we can't grow rice right now. Some other islands like places, not islands, but places like Guyana, they have they can grow rice. Can we get it from them? You know what I mean? So a lot of these things have to we have to have conversations on a regional level. So I grew up under the European Union system, and the European Union cooperates really well. And I would like to see that cooperation extend to CARICOM in a way that the European Union operates when it comes to food. We need full cooperation. We need exchange of information. We need databases that have that information. We need to know when there's a glut. I'll buy those breadfruits from you, Dominica, when you have that glut. So I think those are the solutions right now, and I want more young people, as I said, to see the joy of food science. And one thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of food entrepreneurs don't know that they can access external investment. They think that that is only for TV shows in America or in Europe. Not a little old them could get investment. And because of this mindset, a lot of them don't want to grow. They kind of just make products for their community and what's not. But we can, in the region, we can now access international investment, and we also need the literacy in there. We need to understand that when an investor comes and offers and wants 20% stake in the company, what does that mean for you as the owner? So we need to have that information. We need to show a success story in the region where you have a international investor investing into the company, and is able to scale, even building a factory in that particular island, and scaling and exporting. And one more thing, a lot of food entrepreneurs always want to export. So before they even think of supplying to their community, they think about exporting, because they don't think that they can get a good price for their product in their particular island. And that might be true or false. But the issue goes back, is a bit deeper. And I'll say this: a lot of supermarkets import their food, and they get them from distributors, and distributors get them from another distributor. And a lot of supermarkets do not want to open their doors to small producers to do all the billing and everything else. They don't want to deal with it. So then, if a producer wants to get on a shelf, it's very challenging to get on the shelf in a lot of the regional supermarkets. There's some regional supermarkets that are very local forward, and there's some that are not. And at the end of the day, you can't tell somebody how to run a business, but people need to see where they can win when they are doing something, and they need to see a win.
Those points, particularly your penultimate one on investment, also brought me to specifically thinking about diaspora, and investment by the diaspora. I think, you know, there are things that are certainly being done in terms of markets and being able to ship certain things from the Caribbean to, for instance, the U.S., right? Or the fact that, I can get a can of ackee. Not that I want to eat canned ackee, but that's another story within itself, right? How would you like to see our diaspora really playing a vivid and you know, important role, not just in, supporting these businesses themselves, but really in terms of investing into, um, food sciences and food entrepreneurs from the region?
Very good question. And this one is, I'm going to give you a spinner where this is concerned. So, I was a part of the diaspora up to 1 month ago, and I always talk to people in the diaspora as it relates to that. So the diaspora right now is investing mostly in real estate in the Caribbean, because that's where the money is at the end of the day. But I'll give you some different ways that the diaspora can invest in food sets. If not directly, we have direct investment, like doing a fund and that kind of thing, where promising companies can pull from. But how about creating a pipeline that the companies can send products to you so that you can feed the rest of the diaspora? You have the right to open an LLC in in the US, or a limited company in Europe. And if you have that right to do that, you can create a pathway for the small entrepreneurs. And some businesses have done that already. There are some that are selling Caribbean products online and to the diaspora in North America, and that's going pretty well because you're not missing home as much when you have your little comfort keepers. But I'll say this: the diaspora can also create pool or real estate for certain stores and that kind of thing as well. Because a lot of the times we think of diaspora investment as only creating the fund and like giving back to some of the food companies. But how about them leasing a warehouse, leasing a space that, are we saying French, épicerie fine, a fine grocery store, or even an online store that people can buy that. So there's a lot of different ways that the diaspora can invest, and and these are smaller ways until the confidence is there to invest more heavily into promising companies. Again, they can put their funds into um, certain governmental bodies, and the governmental bodies can put out a call for businesses to come to get that funding as well, or those grants as well, so they can also create grants in their communities as well.
You make a great point. I thought of like virtual businesses like Carib Shopper in that question where, you can definitely
Yes.
order from them and, get whatever regional pepper sauce, whatever it is.
But again, I think that even beyond something like that, I think that there are lots of people in the diaspora looking for something else to do, or even people that are retired that still want to do something. They can create spaces for these particular food businesses in many ways in their communities, in their churches, and get the products moving, get people tasting the products and what's not. It's not only money, it's access to certain markets and to certain people.
Wonderful, wonderful. Um, I think that'll bring me to my penultimate question. Everybody knows, of every Strictly Facts episode, I'm always in love with the way that we connect so many different parts of our culture to popular culture, and in that I mean usually music, but also, books, poetry, novels, etc. In preparation for this episode, I kept singing Super Cat's Vineyard Party. That also led me down a line where I said Super Cat Vineyard Party, then it brought me to the Super Cat and Heavy D song, which is an inspiration for one of Protege's latest songs called At We Feet. I also thought about various Caribbean folk songs that talk about food. And so I would love to turn to you and ask you, what are some of your favorite examples of how Caribbean food shows up in our popular culture?
I'm an old millennial, so this song, I would think for me, I grew up with this one song in mind, and you might not know it, but Stamp on going to Jamaica, we call it fish cakes in Barbados. And I was a little girl, and it would come over every time on the local TV. And basically, it would go fish cakes and bakes, every Bajan does make. And they would talk about the method. You put in the saltfish, you put in the flour, spice it up with seasoning, and add a version of cocoa powder, meaning that the baking powder was the cocoa powder. So I think that that song lives in my head rent free, as it relates to food culture and my heritage and everything else. And we don't hear it enough. I need to call the radio station to put it back on, especially during Independence. It's a lovely song, and it teaches you basically how to make the fish cake.
That's a wonderful example. I'll be sure to add it to our Strictly Facts syllabus for our listeners to check out. I do want us to close with maybe a hopeful note towards a wider future, right? And so if we were to think about, the Caribbean region, Caribbean food economies 20, 30, 40 years ahead, right?
Mhm.
What would it truly really look like for us to be investing in our food systems? Um, what role do you think entrepreneurs, various communities, would
Governments.
play in governments, right? Definitely,
Mhm.
would play in transforming Caribbean food from something we celebrate culturally into something that also sustains us economically for generations to come.
I think it will start from the collective conscience of the people in the region, to be honest. I think it starts with them making more edible spaces in their own homes, having that respect and full sovereignty. It also will look like governments having not really stockpiling, but having um, spaces for ambient food storage in case of any natural disaster, introduction of freeze drying, especially in terms of technology, so that we can freeze dry a lot of the things for a rainy day or a not so rainy day. It would look like more our brands listed in the more affluent supermarkets overseas. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the time I will say to entrepreneurs, if you can't scale, go gourmet. Because when you can't do a lot of products, 100,000 in one SKU, you can make 5,000 in a SKU, but it will be gourmet, it will be more expensive. So I would think that we should have a place just like Asian food has a place, and you will see all of the amazing Indian sauces, like the butter chicken sauces, having a place on certain shelves and outside of communities, because sometimes you only see Caribbean products where you have a Caribbean demographic. So I would like to see more of our products being celebrated outside of that. That's what I see for the next 40 years. And what I would like to also see is that we um, focus on covering more of our arable land. There's a lot of arable land that is not that doesn't have anything right now, and also focus on fruit. There's some islands that do not grow any fruit, and that you can't find any local fruit on some islands. Believe it or not, there are islands like this that exist, and I would like to see more local fruit being grown in the Caribbean. And I want Caribbean farmers to be more adventurous. A lot of us never thought that grapes could grow in the Caribbean. And my dad has been growing grapes for like 20 years. And I always have a grapevine. I have grapes, and people will be like, you grew that at home, and they wouldn't believe me. But to be more adventurous, there's a lot of things that we could be growing that we are importing. We have the climate for grapes. We need to grow grapes, and we have the climate to do strawberries, especially a lot of the more mountainous islands can grow strawberries. Do more of that, because you can do it, and then once you create it, there's a market for it, and that's what I have to say.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Tamar, for joining us for this episode. I think, one thing I'm really pushing us all to do and think about for Caribbean American Heritage Month is think about the future of the Caribbean. And this, I think, is one primary way that we can definitely do that, not just in the immediate future, but how we are thinking about, our lives and the generations of our communities to come. So, with that, I thank you again so much for joining me for this episode. For our Strictly Facts family, I will be sure to tag Tamar in all the social media posts and everything on the Strictly Facts website, and you can be sure to follow her for more. If you're definitely into food science and wanting to learn more, or even get your own products off the ground, in terms of, becoming food entrepreneurs yourselves. And so with that, thank you all. Until next time, look more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspod.com for more information on each episode, and you can find all of our social media platforms there to stay connected.